welcome to Stanford team meeting plus a few extra people, which means that although there's probably a lot of background that I could skip, I'm not going to because I'm pleased that there are people here who are not actually on the research team. Excellent. All right, I have objectives because Sarah asked me to please have objectives. So here's what you will be able to do by the end of this presentation. Describe the motivation for peri-conceptional exposure assessment. Identify 2 biomarkers used for fertility awareness. Describe at least 2 biases inherent in reproductive epi study designs. And refer potential participants to our study. Which, don't get too excited. We're still waiting on IRB, but like any second now. I'm going to call and bother them about it today. So the outline, we'll do a little bit of background and significance. I'll tell you the aims and study procedures and some of our planned outcomes. So here's the background. There is experimental animal and human epi evidence that peri-conceptional exposures to environmental chemicals or other exposures can have short and long-term health effects. Okay? Some of these may include things like fecundity, growth, and development. Fecundity, for those of you who are not reproductive epidemiologists, is talking about probability of conception, okay, and about how many conceptions, how many babies you can have. Okay, growth and development, pretty obvious. Is this working? Awesome. Okay, so that brings us to our first vocabulary word for the day, peri-conceptional. What's that? I'll tell you, Microsoft Word doesn't know this word. It always wants to change it to something else, usually something wrong. And so let's just start at the beginning. From the Latin, peri means around. Think back to perimeter, like measuring around something. Conception, conception. But the question is, how big is that? If we're talking about something around conception, like what do we mean? And other studies have used the month in which a couple conceived, or from 1 month before to the month after, or 1 month before to the end of the first trimester, or the year before conception, or the year including conception. These are pretty broad windows. And for some of the exposures that we're going to be thinking about, where it may be something that was transient and happened on one day, we don't think this is very good. I mean, like, if you're exposed to, say, medical radiation in January, and then you conceive a baby in August, like, do we really think that that matters? You know, maybe, but probably not so much. So one of the innovations of our project is going to be restricting the time window that we're calling peri-conceptional to approximately 1 week. And this is one of our primary innovations. So early environmental exposures matter. This is a kind of popular book that came out just last year. Will take you about 26 minutes to read, should any of you want to. Okay, it's actually a little longer than that, but I'm meaning to say that it's pretty light reading. This has been popularly known as the Barker hypothesis after this scientist in England whose name was Barker, who hypothesized that events leading up to birth are associated with health in adult life. And he first studied this among people who were pregnant during parts of World War II when they were extremely nutritionally deprived. And then he saw outcomes in the offspring. So the humans who had been in utero while their mothers were starving and what happened to them when they were like 50. Okay. There's been other evidence about exposure to endocrine disruptors during the fetal period that suggests it affects the development of all organ systems. And there's some evidence from ART, which is assisted reproductive technologies like in vitro fertilization, that the fetal environment affects gene expression and eventual phenotype. Okay, so here we're talking about, you know, health in adult life. Whoa. Oh, I touched the screen, that's the problem. So we're suggesting that early exposures affect health in adult life, affect all organ systems, affect gene expression and phenotype. So, you know, that's pretty much everything. But the question is, what other exposures might matter, and how could we study that? Well, in reproductive epi, the studies usually focus on pregnancy-related exposures and outcomes for women and their babies. They usually don't include the men. Just studying women is logistically efficient. You know, most pregnant women can have at least 13 prenatal visits, at which point you can sit them down and have them do questionnaires, and they're already collecting urine to test for other things, and you know, you can poke them and grab blood. But really, is it the best we can do? I mean, we would say that the man has something to contribute to a pregnancy, and we should probably see what's happening to him too. So another innovation of our study is that we are including both partners for biomonitoring at the time of ovulation. Okay, so men count too. Many studies in reproductive epi are case control studies. And this is a really reasonable strategy because most of the outcomes that we want to study are rare. But the question is, what sort of bias does this introduce into our science? Well, it certainly introduces the potential for recall bias, wherein mothers who have experienced the outcome of interest, let's say a baby born with a birth defect, they might have a different motivation to recall exposures than the mom that's sitting there in the hospital with a perfect baby. And she'll say, oh no, I didn't have any exposures, even though like she painted the house or something. And so recall bias is a concern if we're trying to estimate exposures that happened early on. The other issue is you may be asking people to recall exposures for a specific time for which they don't necessarily have a reference, or we don't know what the right time is to ask them about. There's also selection bias because enrolling at delivery selects for people who delivered, which means that we would miss the people who had a miscarriage or who never got pregnant at all. And a smaller issue about selection bias is that it would select for a population who delivers in the hospital, which is the majority of people, but nationally the home birth rate is getting up to about 2%, and it's higher in some populations. So, depending, you might be systematically missing somebody. So in EPI, a lot of times, if we can, we want to do a cohort study, okay? Like you do a case control because that's all you can do. But if you could do it, you would do a cohort study. And so cohort studies in reproductive epidemiology tend to enroll during pregnancy, okay? Because that's where the people are, all right? And they try to recruit early in pregnancy, like at the first prenatal visit or in the first trimester. And that way they can include laboratory testing along with prenatal care. But once again, we need to think about the biases that are created by this strategy. Everyone's eating, so I'm not going to do call and response. But think in your head, what bias are we getting here? Well, I filled a whole slide. Potential for selection bias, because of course we're only including women or couples, if you involve the man, who actually achieve pregnancy. So we're missing the people who don't get pregnant. This strategy also selects for the population that seeks prenatal care early. And so if those people who, are calling their midwife as soon as they miss their period, and the midwife says, okay, well, come in 6 or 8 weeks, those people are probably different than the ones whose belly's out to here and says, maybe I should go see somebody. All right? So information bias is another potential problem. We may underestimate miscarriage as an outcome because by the time someone is seeking prenatal care, the time at which we think that most miscarriages happen has already passed, and so they were maybe unrecognized. Some of the exposures of interest might have already changed. For example, a woman might say, oh, I'm pregnant now, I better stop drinking coffee, which happens. Or it may be that she's not feeling well, and as a consequence, she stops drinking coffee because, oh, that's not a nice thing to vomit back up in the morning. Another issue is that some of the exposures that we might care about may have dissipated. It may be that what we really cared about was an exposure that was happening around the time of implantation, and that happened to be the time at which they moved to a new house and got it sprayed for roaches. But by the time they're 6, 8 weeks along, the pesticide is gone. So I'm trying to set the stage to say that timing for environmental exposure assessment can really matter. We're asserting that exposures before conception might influence the probability of conception and also of pregnancy outcomes. Exposures that might happen to a woman before she recognizes that she's pregnant might influence fetal development and pregnancy outcomes, including miscarriage. And I'm also going to remind you that by the time a woman recognizes that she's pregnant, the embryo has already experienced significant development. I even have a graph or a figure of this. So the heart is formed by 22 days after conception. The neural tube is formed by 28 days. And depending on the length of a woman's cycle and how aware she is of her menstrual cycle, by that point, her period may be less than 2 weeks late. Okay, so some really important development has already happened before many people might even realize that they were pregnant. As I mentioned before, environmental exposures that we might care about might be transient, which means that they might be there one day and then not the next, and they may have already exerted their effect. So that by the time the pregnancy is recognized or a woman enters prenatal care, the relevant exposure may have dissipated, unrecognized, and unmeasured, in which case that's a missed opportunity for us to be able to estimate the effect of that exposure on her pregnancy. So for truly complete lifetime environmental exposure assessment, we're going to assert that environmental monitoring must begin with both parents at or before conception. Okay, so here's the bottom line. If we're ever going to figure out the relationship between acute, transient environmental exposures and biological events, then we need to do our exposure assessment at the biologically relevant time. So what we're doing in this project is demonstrate a simple method for exposure assessment that's timed to ovulation, which might be conception. All right. Okay, let me go back for a sec. Blank for a sec. Here's the thing. So if you ask many people, if you went over to say, oh, the OBGYN department and stopped people in the hall and said, what day is ovulation? Many of them, I dare say most of them, except for the ones who went to Dr. Stanford's lecture last week, would say day 14. Of course, the cycle's 28 days. Ovulation happens on day 14. So if you care about environmental exposures around ovulation, measure on day 14. But here's the problem. People are not widgets, and biological systems aren't usually that discrete, okay? And there is good evidence from multiple studies, including one done by Dr. Stanford, that suggests that the day of ovulation varies from woman to woman. Now really, just think for 1 second. Should that be surprising? No. I mean, I'm taller than Kylie and Danielle's taller than me. We're not all the same, so why would we really expect that all of our menstrual cycles were the same? It's kind of silly when you think about it. So anyway, this is, data from a study in which they collected menstrual cycle data from 426 women who were not using exogenous hormones, and these are the estimated days of ovulation based on cervical fluid monitoring. And so day 14 is in blue here, and you can see that it was only about 9% of women who actually ovulated on day 14. Okay, so if we were going to do our environmental exposure assessment timed to a calendar day, would we be right or wrong? Most of the time, we'd be wrong. Okay, we'd be picking the wrong day. We'd do a little better if we were picking day 15 or 17, but still, here's the thing, we can do better. So women and couples can learn to determine their fertile window and identify ovulation by observing their own biomarkers, and that's partly what this study is about. So the work in the HOPE study is based on work that a whole bunch of us sitting in the back row, that Karen and Sarah and Kylie and Narutma and Dr. Stanford and I have done over the last few years. It's called the Peak Day Study, where we use a really simple educational method to teach women to identify when they're ovulating by changes in their cervical fluid. Most women identify ovulation in less than 2 cycles. Okay, they can learn this. And it's not news that women can learn to identify ovulation. The part that's news about this is that they do it by reading a 3-page brochure and having some example charts. Okay, most previous studies, well-done studies of fertility awareness or natural family planning methods, have relied on methods where the couples have one-on-one interaction with a trained teacher. And that's just not something that's feasible if we're imagining something on the scale of the National Children's Study. I mean, we can't have a teacher meet with every couple 8 times in a year to teach them how to do this. We need something that people can do on their own and is still reliable. So this is our sample fertility chart. It's on a piece of paper it looks really simple. On a slide it looks kind of busy. But what happens is at the top we have cycle day and date. We include day of the week on here because although theoretically you're writing it down every day, sometimes people don't. And the more memory triggers you can give someone, the more likely you are to get higher quality data. So we mark if there's vaginal bleeding, cervical fluid, and then some characteristics of the fluid, and they mark their peak day. This gray area is for recording basal body temperature, which is temperature that first thing in the morning before you do anything else, which tends to be low at the beginning of the cycle, and then just after ovulation it goes beep, peaks up, and then stays high until the onset of the next menses. So what can happen is that the cervical fluid indicates ovulation is approaching, and then when temperature goes up, it said, yep, you ovulated. So the minimum amount of data that people collect is actually just the first few rows of the chart, where they're marking if they check for cervical fluid, if there is any, and then does the fluid feel slippery, does it look clear or partly clear, and does it stretch 1 inch without breaking. And just with those questions, that's how you can determine which day is your peak day. The temperature part is optional, although it can be exceedingly helpful. For the HOPE study, we're going to ask people to collect temperature as well, because particularly when you're in the learning phase about observing the cervical fluid, having the temperature as a second check can help you realize, oh, yep, that was peak type mucus. So hopefully they'll do it. We're going to give them thermometers. We compared the peak day method to a blinded fertility monitor and found that women were using only the peak day algorithm, agreeing with the monitor by plus or minus 3 days. Okay, so it's not perfect. Like, we would love it if it was the exact same day, but there's some variability in the monitor too, and so the fact that we can get it to a pretty tight window of a week, I think, is good enough. Thank you. So here's a figure of that same thing. So that when I'm talking about plus or minus 3 days, we have so if this day is the day the monitor identifies as the peak, the algorithm picked that same day 30% of the time, within 2 days 75% of the time, and within 3 days 92% of the time. Okay, and for something that's basically costs a piece of paper, pretty good, because those monitors, they're expensive. The monitor itself costs about $150, and the test strips cost more than $1 a day. Okay, so don't think, oh well, I'll just go buy a monitor. It's a lot. So that brings us to our study that is just ready to get started. The fancy title that we submitted to NIH was Peri-Conceptionally Timed Biomonitoring. But really you need an acronym, and so we're calling it the Home Observation of Peri-Conceptional Exposures, which translates to HOPE. And this hopefully will work well for recruiting, that we can ask people, do you hope to be pregnant soon, and get them thinking about being in our study. So I'm going to talk about the aims, and this is the same language that was in the grant, which I know it doesn't really work that great for a presentation. This is meant to be a little bit of mentoring and career development to help you see what specific aims look like. Okay, so think about it that way. It's not that I was being lazy about making slides. Not at all. So the first aim is to conduct prospective peri-ovulational biomonitoring for disinfection byproducts and bisphenol A, which is BPA, in a human preconception cohort using a novel strategy of self-collection, environmental and biological specimens triggered by observation of fertility signs in community-dwelling population. Wow, that's a lot. So let's kind of go back to some of these key words. I checked on PubMed yesterday. This is a trick that Dr. Joy uses a lot to show how popular or important things are. So I just searched on some of these words. Peri-conceptional, 891 articles in PubMed, some of which are those ones where they're calling peri-conceptional like the year before to the year after conception. So, really that one should probably be lower. Disinfection byproducts, there are 647. Do y'all know what disinfection byproducts are? I mean, here's the thing. It's like when the water comes down Big Cottonwood Canyon and they do some filtration and some stuff to it to hopefully get out the Giardia. Then one of the things that happens before it goes out into the distribution system is that they add a disinfectant. Depending on where you live, it's either chlorine or chloramine. And then as it goes through the distribution system, that chlorine or chloramine reacts with some of the other organic matter that is still in the water. Think like molecular sized bits of leaves and stuff, okay? And it forms what they call disinfection byproducts. So we talk about haloacetic acids and trihalomethanes. And why do we care? Well, so there have been some studies, like big ecologic type studies, that have showed slightly compelling results that suggest that people who are drinking water that have disinfection byproducts in it have a higher risk of bladder cancer, okay? So since that came out in, I don't know, it was like the 90s, there have been whole lots of other studies trying to replicate those findings and like suggest that disinfection byproducts are bad for all kinds of health things. Here's the problem. Most of them don't show anything. Like the findings are right around relative risks of 1 or nothing. And most of the assertion is that their exposure assessment wasn't very good. That they might have taken the level of the drinking water utility. So let's say you live in Salt Lake City and somebody took a drinking water sample in Rose Park, which is the very end of the Big Cottonwood Canyon water distribution system, which is where the disinfection byproducts would be the very highest, and use that level to estimate, say, my level, even though I live by the university. And nobody even bothered to ask me how much water I drink or how often I shower or if I go swimming or anything else. So, there's still, some people are holding out hope, which may be the wrong word, that they'll really figure out how disinfection byproducts might be bad for you. So we wanted to include that as a part of this study because since we're doing prospective monitoring, we're going to ask people about how much water they drank and how much showering they did and how they washed their dishes and how often they went swimming. Because if we're ever going to figure it out, that's the way that we're going to do it. Okay, that's about all I'm going to say about disinfection byproducts, but now you've heard about it. So trihalomethanes is one kind of disinfection byproduct. Bisphenol A, you've all heard about this. That was 6,556 articles. So I pulled out a few of these BPA things. Well, the other thing about these two kind of environmental contaminants is that everybody's talking about them. Disinfection byproducts a little less than BPA, but here bottled water contains disinfection byproducts, fertilizer residue, and pain medication. What a bargain! You never knew you were getting all that in your bottle. Because many bottled water is just somebody else's tap water. So if any of you thinking that you're getting a good deal from bottled water, suckers. And then this is more recent. Human exposure to BPA has been grossly underestimated. Canada declared BPA to be toxic. We've seen all kinds of articles about how they're taking it out of things like baby bottles because, of course, babies who are artificially fed spend a lot of time sucking out of plastic bottles. I concur that it's probably a good idea to take it out of bottles, but really what we should be doing is just promoting breastfeeding rather than artificial feeding. That's talk for another day. In a feast of data on BPA, there's no final answer. This is one where I think people have potentially jumped ahead of the science and said, oh, BPA, this is a scary thing. Let's get it out of everything without really figuring out what it might be doing. But anyway, I will jump on that bandwagon because that's probably what got my study funded. Because here's the thing, BPA is hot. DBPs are still kind of warm. So we'll do that too. This was just November 22. Did you guys hear this on the news about BPA lurks in canned soups? It was a fabulous study done by some people at Harvard. I think it was actually someone's master's project. And here's what they did. Okay, you don't have to pull up the original JAMA article. They got a JAMA, by the way, not a real article. It was like a letter, a research letter. They took volunteers, and it was a crossover type study. So it's like they had 10 people, I think. And for a week, 5 of the people had a 12-ounce serving of a commercially available canned vegetable soup. It was Progresso. Every day between like 12 and 1. And on like the 3rd, 4th, and 5th days, they took biospecimens to be analyzed for BPA. Okay, the other group during the same times had 12 ounces of some freshly prepared vegetable soup using the same sort of ingredients but from fresh. Okay, and then they had like a week washout period, and then the group switched. And so they were doing these measures, and the weeks when the people were eating the canned soup, their BPA levels, you ready? 1,000 times higher. Fascinating, because they didn't try to change any of the rest of their diets, so they were still getting their BPA from Diet Coke and everything else. But, you know, like that. Wow. I mean, if you went on a SpaghettiOs bender the weekend before you ovulated, then, you know, maybe it would matter. It's always successful when I can make Joe laugh. That's great. So, yes, it was on public health students and faculty. Like, so cool. Which, by the way, like, if you have the opportunity to get involved in research, you know, do it. Sometimes it pays good money. I did so many studies when I was in college. Oh, well, in grad school. Anyway, that's also a story for another day. So what is our study going to add to 6,000 something articles? Well, here's the thing. We are doing prospective daily measurements of BPA and disinfection byproducts in both the male and female partners time to the fertile window. Okay. So what's going to happen is with the onset of fertile quality cervical mucus, we're going to have them start collecting urine every day. And then at the end of the fertile window, the man can stop because they've either conceived or not. And the woman is going to continue to the end of her cycle, so either her next period or a positive pregnancy test. So we will have daily specimens that could be tested for levels. Okay. Exposure to these chemicals is ubiquitous, one of my favorite words, but transient. The half-life is pretty short. You know, if you did go on a SpaghettiOs bender and your BPA levels went like sky high, you know, probably by Wednesday they'd be back down to normal if you got off the canned food. Okay, but the normal range is not well described. In many of these other studies, even studies about BPA and pregnancy or pregnancy outcomes, they might have taken like blood and urine twice during a pregnancy. And so we know that there's going to be seasonal variation, there's daily variation. You know, in the summer, when you can eat food out of your garden or from your parents' garden, or possibly from the farmer's market, your BPA is probably going to be lower than now that it's winter and you're eating canned peaches. You know? Janice. BPA is not too much. Our lab samples are like $30 or something. And honestly, although we're collecting them every single day, we're probably not going to analyze them for every single day right away. We're going to bank everything in a freezer. And we're definitely going to analyze for conception cycles. We'll definitely analyze those. And you know, right at the time of ovulation for everybody. That's the priority. And then the others will just, you know, be sitting there as a golden shining source of data. And so here's the thing, that if high exposure to BPA or disinfection byproducts around the time of conception is a problem, then this study design would be the way to figure it out, at least from an exposure assessment perspective. It's not going to be the way to figure out if that's causing autism when the kids are 4, because we're not following them that long yet. But those will be the subsequent grants to try and, like, once you've got people in your study, you don't want to let them go, okay? So the impact is this, that if conception occurred that cycle, we'll have biomarkers of exposure at the time of conception and implantation, okay? All right, so aim 2, we're going to be evaluating the association between these exposures in male and female, and the reproductive outcomes are going to be semen quality and time to pregnancy, which means that the Center for Human Toxicology and Andrology folks are key partners here because they're doing the analyses. And what this will add is correlating the exposures that we measured in AIM-1 with the outcomes. So for semen quality, BPA has been associated with sperm damage. It's been in humans. Somebody went to a factory where they make BPA in China and found that the workers had pretty bad sperm. And time to pregnancy itself is a sensitive measure of reproductive effect, okay? Because here's the thing, exposure levels might be low enough to have no effect. You know, your BPA level might be going all over the place, but it may not actually matter for reproductive health outcomes. So, you know, maybe we don't need to change all those can linings. Who knows? So AIM-3, this is much more a methodological kind of epi-aim, where we're going to quantify the misclassification bias generated by retrospective exposure assessment methods in common use compared to prospective biomonitoring and sampling. Wow, lots of long words there. But what this means is that since we're measuring prospectively both via questionnaires and biospecimens and retrospectively via questionnaires, we can estimate how wrong everybody else's studies are, okay, that only measure retrospectively by questionnaire. And so interestingly, I went to grad school with a woman who is now like a BPA researcher, and I was talking to her on the phone the other day, and she said, here's the thing. Biospecimens for BPA, and this is a quote, they're just kind of a sucky measure. She's like, you better think about doing something other than just urine. And I was like, yeah, because we're doing questionnaires too. Because it's something where, because you could measure it in biospecimens, people kind of jumped onto doing that. But they're realizing more and more that if you only have a one-time measure and there's no contextual data to go with it, that it's not very useful. So it's something where you need to do much more comprehensive exposure assessment to have it be useful. So anyway, this was all submitted in October 2010, and we found out, we officially got the award notice August 15th, 2011. So this is just to remind you of the glacial pace of federal funding agencies. And NIEHS is the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Okay. So here's the basic idea, that we're recruiting couples trying to conceive as early as possible in their reproductive journey. We'll teach them the peak day method for prospective identification of ovulation, have them collect biospecimens based on their biological triggers, and do a pile of questionnaires. Although almost everything's going to be online, so they won't actually see the pile. They'll just see like a little, percent complete thing. So here's where we are. We're waiting on the IRB, buying supplies, making up collection kits, and planning for recruitment. Okay, so here's the inclusion criteria. We're looking for couples who are planning pregnancy within 3 months. Sometimes people giggle a little when I say planning pregnancy because, approximately half of pregnancies in this country are unplanned, but I'm going on the glass half full, which means that half of them are planned. And in Utah, the number is slightly higher, but slightly more than half are planned, okay? If people contact us saying that they're interested, but they're planning to stay on birth control pills or something for a little while yet, we're going to put them in a bin called limbo and not actually enroll them, but we'll keep pestering them. So we'll check back in with them every couple weeks to try and get them right when they start, which is going to be a challenge. That's probably going to be our biggest challenge, is getting people in time. Because if you're of normal fertility, by the time you stop contracepting, you can get pregnant very fast, and we don't want to miss that. So for women, we're saying 18 to 35, men 18 to 40. We want them to live within an hour drive of here because shipping the biospecimens just added a whole other level of complexity that we didn't want to deal with, okay? And English speaking. Exclusion, it looks like kind of a long list. It's not that bad. If women have had fewer than 9 menstrual flows in the previous 12 months, it's not a strict exclusion criteria. That's like something to check back in on, to say, why is that? Because they may have been taking an oral contraceptive that made them not have a menstrual period. They might have been breastfeeding, and some of those would not be an exclusion criteria. If they used an implantable hormonal contraceptive in 2 months, injectable is a 12-month exclusion because we know that it just takes a lot of people a long time to bounce back from depot shots. If they were previously diagnosed with infertility, subfertility, or anything that might affect fertility, or if they never had that diagnosis but had ever tried to conceive for a year or more and didn't get pregnant. Men, pretty same, except for all that oral contraceptive stuff, that if they've been diagnosed with infertility or been unsuccessful in conceiving after a year of non-contracepted intercourse. All right, so we are doing most of our recruitment by just trying to get the word out in various ways, and that will include things like ads, listservs, flyers, postings with marriage prep courses, try and get in at the Marriage License Bureau, because there are plenty of people who want to start trying as soon as they get married. We might as well catch them. Social networking, we already have a Facebook page. we're going to use this new online registry called researchmatch.org, which I'll be interested to see if that actually works, where it's been set up with the National Centers for Clinical and Translational Science to help connect people who are like, ooh, me, I want to be in a study, with a researcher who needs them. And local healthcare practitioners, Planned Parenthood has agreed to tell people about our study when they're like taking out IUDs and stuff like that. For people who are in the study, there will also be an incentive if they refer their friends. All right. Most of the way we'll interact with people is actually online. The surveys are all, the questionnaires are online. We found out that you can actually do it on your iPhone or Droid phone. There's like a mobile view version. So we're going to be making sure to modify the way all of our surveys look so that you don't have to like scroll over and stuff like that. We found that this is really helpful. People like to do stuff online, and even our consent form is online, and the IRB was A-okay with that. So at enrollment, people are going to do a whole lot of questionnaires. They're going to do BPA and disinfection byproduct exposures, demographics, all this stuff. Some of this, like birth history, this is, there's some thinking that like the exposures that, say, I had when I was a fetus might predict my later reproductive ability to get pregnant and so on. And so, we're going to be asking people, like, were you conceived via IVF? What was your birth weight? They may or may not know. This is considered kind of an exploratory aim. We'll see. So there's all that. Then there'll be an in-person enrollment visit where Kylie gets to go and visit the people and really explain to them what they have to do, drop off the specimen collection kits. At this point, we're actually going to be measuring height and weight so that it's not just self-report on that, because if we're already visiting, why not? Get as good of a data as we can. We're also going to take a hair snip and distribute our booklet and explain when to do what. We're going to have a better figure than this, but I just wanted to leave you with the impression that our participants have to do a lot, okay? I mean, they're charting their fertility, they're collecting urine, men just through the fertile or fecund window, women to the end of the cycle. Once they've identified ovulation, then the next day, both man and woman are going to complete a saliva sample. And then we're also collecting semen specimens from the men, which just happens somewhere between ovulation and the end of the cycle, because we don't want our collection to impact their probability of getting pregnant. So we want that to happen after ovulation. And we'll be able to look for BPA and effects on the semen quality there. And all of these biospecimens they would do for 2 cycles. And then we have all those retrospective assessments too that will happen at ovulation plus 18 days, plus 6 weeks, and plus 38 weeks, which will simulate what happens in other types of studies. Like upon recognizing that you're pregnant is the 18 days, first prenatal visit is 6 weeks, and delivery is 38 weeks. So we'll be asking them to think back and report their exposures. So it's a lot, which is why we're going to pay them $400. So some of the questionnaires, like for BPA, we're going to be asking people about eating canned foods and using polycarbonate plastics, which are number 7. And for disinfectant byproducts, it's like drinking, bathing, washing, swimming, everything that has to do with water. And we're asking all this stuff at enrollment, but then we're asking a lot of this stuff again at the first recall time to see if being in the study or trying to conceive has made people change their behaviors. Because, once we start asking them about microwaving and plastic, they might start to think, maybe I shouldn't do that. And we want to be able to have accurate. So the biospecimens, we're going to be collecting urine, which is the FMU is first morning urine in important BPA-free cups. And they'll just collect it and then pour it in like a 50 ml specimen container and just put it in the freezer. Okay. The semen SCD is a semen collection device. Doesn't that sound fancy? Really, it's like a condom with a twist tie and a Ziploc bag that it goes into. But it's really important that we give them the semen collection devices so that they don't maybe use their favorite brand of condom that has BPA in it. We need everybody's to be the same. Saliva This is actually something brand new where the Center for Human Toxicology is working on developing a measure to quantify BPA in saliva. So the plan is we're going to collect it, they're going to figure out how to analyze it, and that's in progress. And hair, honestly, we don't have a hypothesis about hair, but it just seems silly not to get it. So we're getting it. We're going to be banking the biospecimens. We had to put this special wording in the consent form. Importantly, people can opt out of the specimen banking. We'll still collect their specimens and use them for this study, but if they opt out, then we'll get rid of them. And we have to keep enough identifiers with the specimens that if in 10 years they call back and say, hey, you have my semen, throw it away, we'll be able to do that. So our goal is to get 300 couples over 3 years. We will be paying them $400, and they'll also get a free digital thermometer, pregnancy test kits, and they get to learn the weekday method. We'll be open for recruitment soon, hopefully next week. If you want to learn more, you can find us on Facebook. Look for Hope Study Utah. It's actually not really live yet. There's nothing on it because the IRB hasn't approved it, but soon. Our Gmail account is live. You could email Kylie if you wanted to, or talk to us. This cute kid is signing more. Show me more. So here, the objectives, check. Describe the motivation for peri-conceptional exposure assessment. Because if we want to know if those exposures matter, we better measure them then. Okay. 2 biomarkers. Anybody? Cervical fluid and temperature. 2, the biases. You know, I mean, there are numerous. Selection bias because you're missing people. Recall bias because they're, you know, you're asking someone, did you take a Tylenol 32 weeks ago? Like, who knows, you know? I mean, we know in situations like that, people just tend to report their typical behavior. So for something that is a typical exposure, like, well, yes, I have a glass of red wine for dinner every day, you know, then they would probably be pretty good. But for something like, I had my house sprayed for roaches, I mean, who knows? Maybe if they could go back to their calendar. How would you refer potential participants to our study? Send them to Facebook or talk to one of us.